Yeah, thanks everyone for being here tonight. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Georgia to you all. I've known Georgia for a number of years now, and I actually met Geo when she was doing her first book, 100 Australian Birds. And it was really nice to hear about this adventure that she'd embarked upon. And as the book developed, I was very impressed to finally get to see it. But one of the things that's always impressed me about Georgia is her really clear love and respect for the wild places that she's so passionate about. And also that respect and kindness extends to all the people around her. So she's a genuinely very lovely person to know. And we're very privileged to have Georgia come to talk to us tonight. So I won't say too much about Georgia other than that, and she can fill you in on anything else she wishes to about her background and interests. But I will just quickly acknowledge that this, firstly, this presentation and this evening was part of a Victorian Landcare grant that Friends of Sassafras Creek have been running. And we'll let Helen in the front door. And that's been a really fabulous project ongoing in the Secret Garden in Sassafras Creek to restore the habitat there for all the wildlife. Thanks for coming, and I'll hand over to Georgia and we'll try and dull the lights, and hopefully everyone online, we've got folks online. It'd be great if those online that when you have a question, if you can type it into the chat for the end and we can.
Thank you. That was such a lovely introduction. Very kind. And thanks to Friends of Sassafras Creek for inviting me to talk to you guys today. I'm excited to talk about because it's of things. So for an illustrator, I'm based just in Belgrave, so I consider the Dandenong Ranges to be home. A few of my books are floating around the crowd, so if you want to have a look, I can pass them around, and I think you'll pretty quickly get a sense that what I'm passionate about is communicating a love of native animals and plants to people. So that's really my goal with a lot of my work, is to try and engage people, particularly people who maybe don't have that existing passion for wildlife, to try and get to see the beauty of these animals, and hopefully, you know, just get my hooks in a little bit to get people passionate about protecting our biodiversity. So this is a really nice topic for me because I feel like I kind of have my feet in camps. I try and write with some scientific accuracy, but I also do my own drawings. So I kind of come at the topic from both sides, if that makes sense. Just to start though, looking at this image, it makes me think about how influential our context is in the way that we approach conservation and the way that we think about the landscape and how we think about resource use. So I thought I'd start by just giving a tiny bit of context about where we are tonight. So 350 million years ago, it's a really short history, I promise. There were a series of volcanic events that produced the Dandenong Ranges, and at the same time it produced the Strathbogies, yes, and Mount Macedon as well. And over time, various weathering events and the moving of tectonic plates has meant that these mountains have gradually receded. So they're at the height they are today, but they used to be up to 6,000 meters high, so really high, and now they're much more diminished. And of course, sorry?
It's nosebleed territory.
Yeah, totally. It's hard to imagine. But then over time, it's developed into this beautiful mountain ash forest that we so strongly associate with this landscape. And I think we would all agree that imagining the Dandenong Ranges without this rainforest, it's not the same place. Like you wouldn't imagine it as being the same place. So for a little bit more history, the first Indigenous people that came to this land would have come up to the Dandenong Ranges to use it as a summer hunting ground. So it was mostly Bunurong people from the south and Woiwurrung from the north. And the Dandenong Ranges served as a kind of meeting place where they could go and take advantage of these replenished stocks of animals and plants and resources. And as the years went on, a lot of those pilgrimages stopped, and then with the kind of development of settler colonies, Melbourne gradually has expanded, and now we've got really suburban areas around the Dandenong Ranges. We've really been absorbed into outer Melbourne. And so the result is that you have a landscape that we look at today. We have remnant forests, but we've got a lot of suburban development, and we've lost some of our old growth trees, and our wildlife corridors are kind of diminishing before our eyes. So it's sort of in that context that I came to write my 3 books, and it's really coloured my view because I'd sit in the back office of our house in Belgrave, and what I saw out the window is what influenced my thinking for the day and what I felt was really urgent. And to me, loss of biodiversity is a very urgent issue that needs attention. So I thought I would just open with that as a bit of context, because that's where we're all sitting today. It's all of those historical events have fed into us ending up here talking about the issues of today. For a little bit more info about this painting, so this is Eugène Bongerard, who's a very famous Australian painter. He did a lot of landscapes. But I found this particular painting really moving because you can see it's labelled Fern Tree Gully. And this is a very different Fern Tree Gully than the one that I drive through every other day. You can see some live oaks down here at the front. And it just, it again reminds me of the kind of symbolic value of landscape and how much we imbue places with a sense of the land, the plants and the animals that we associate with an area. I was also reading an article recently about this particular artist's work, and he had such attention to detail and such accuracy with portraying plants that some conservationists have actually been referring back to his paintings, because they were pre-photographic era, to see what was the vegetation at that time. Can we actually look to restore that kind of diversity in those areas? So you can see beyond the more kind of abstract connection between art and science, it's actually a really direct connection between art as a kind of biological catalogue and the way that we then go about doing conservation science. So that's kind of my opening spiel. But I guess the point of my talk today is to try and emphasize the connection between art and science, and why art is actually really important and perhaps should exist in tandem with science. I think in modern culture, we really think of science as being something quite separate from art, maybe something in opposition to art. So if I think about defining science, I think everyone has a pretty strong idea of what science is. We use the scientific method, we gather evidence to test a theory, and then ideally we come out with some essential truths, something that we can predict against. So hopefully we can plan for the future, or we can make reparations. So there's something kind of solid and rational and completely objective about science. And I think that's kind of important to emphasize, is this idea that we strive for objectivity in science, that it's a kind of universal truth. It's not through an individual lens. But on the other side, art is really different. Art's completely subjective. It's about an individual view channeled into a work and expressing a particular meaning. So on my blurb for the event, I actually put that I was going to define art, but that's a really tricky thing to do. So I'm going to get some help because I'm really curious to know what you think art is, because I think it will be really telling what we all consider art to be. And there's no wrong answer. I'm just really interested to know, art could be a sculpture, dance, writing. It doesn't matter the medium, but what is it that we're doing with art? So anyone want to volunteer an opinion, or should I throw someone under the bus?
It's a portrayal, to me, it's a portrayal of life, what we see in areas like this, even in urban areas.
Yeah.
And it's capturing that. And as this image is done here, it's captured it from 1866.
Yeah.
We look at it today and we can realise it's alive, but we can recognise the types of tree ferns and things like that. So it's it's potentially a documentation of history.
Yeah.
Be it art, be it photographs, lino cuts, anything.
Of a moment. Yeah. Sort of window in time. Totally. Is anybody else?
Got Toby online saying art is created for an audience.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think that's, I guess that's kind of true. Is that it's kind of like if a tree falls in the forest, like if nobody sees the artwork, is it still an artwork? I'd argue yes, but I do think that the audience is important, because I think generally we make art with the idea that we have an intention of trying to express something, and hopefully the people who look at the artwork, it resonates with them and they have a reaction.
It stretches your mind.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's what's, does anybody else have any other definitions of art? Yeah, I think in its broadest form. Yeah.
Also be able to share what you see with other people who don't get the opportunity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
You take a photograph and you put it somewhere, there might be somebody, let's say, in a wheelchair or an aged care facility, somewhere where they just cannot get out, don't have a driver's license.
Yeah.
They're able to share what you've seen.
Yeah.
And portray art,
Yeah.
watercolor, whatever it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've got one more on the line, Judith.
Thanks, Alex.
The translation of our inner world into tangible form.
Oh, wow. That's good. Yeah. Yeah, that's very, very eloquent. So I guess, the common theme, I suppose, of most of our definitions is that art is expressing a fairly specific worldview. Often it's the worldview of just one individual. And so while science is objective, art is completely subjective. It kind of embraces the personal bias that we all have because we're trying to express a very particular viewpoint. And so across the course of this talk, what I'm trying to get across is how valuable that is for expressing a different point of view, maybe one that you've never experienced before. And that's the power of art, is that it allows you to empathize with a position that you perhaps don't already hold. Or if you do share the same views, it really resonates when you view it. So yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few different artworks, some pretty classic Australian artworks, and we'll go through kind of what I think they're trying to say about the landscape, what it reflects about the culture that painted that image and what they think about the landscape and land use. And then hopefully I'll bring it back to my work and kind of how that's influenced decisions that I've made. So first I'm going to start off by showing you 3 different perspectives on the same historical event. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is the founding of Australia. I think most of you will know what this historical event is. This is the arrival of the first fleet, presumably at Botany Bay. And you can see, looking at this artwork, the artist has a very particular kind of emotion that he's trying to express in this image. I would say there's a very specific use of the light hitting the men in their uniforms, hitting the Union Jack flag, hitting the trees. And I think crucially, you can see in the foreground, the trees have actually been felled to create the framing for this flag being raised. And maybe the most important thing is that you don't see any other figures in the landscape. There's not a sense that the land has been occupied. So I think you can see in the artist's view, he's expressing this there's not much consideration for mobility, history of the land. And there's a kind of sense of grandiosity, I think, in this image. So that's one view of this event. We have Tommy McRae's view, and this is a very different perspective. So this is a group of Wathaurong men having their kind of a convict ship coming into shore. And you can see that we've really taken an opposing view where the men are actually standing on the ground as almost a part of the land, and they're looking out at this ship, which is kind of almost a sinister looming presence. It's hard to interpret the image even. So immediately looking at that, it gives you a different feeling about the whole situation, doesn't it? You can imagine a very different perspective if it's your own land that's just, 2 major perspectives on the historical event. And then we've got a more modern view. This is Sean Tan. Does anybody know Sean Tan? Yeah, so he's a wonderful illustrator from Adelaide originally, I think. He does this as an adult, and they're super valuable, really interesting. And this particular artwork is from a book called The Rabbits. So this city wasn't actually painted in the background. So he started to exhibit the triptych, and all of his peers said there's something missing. You need to add a city in the background. So he added this view of Melbourne in the background, and then it was met with much critical acclaim. And that's really telling, I think, of the culture of that time, what they thought the land was to be used for, this kind of tale of taming the land, of clearing the land, of kind of bending the land to human purposes. That's the kind of view that I see them expressing in these artworks. For a more contrasting view, these are 2 Indigenous artworks in the traditional Western desert dot painting style. And I think maybe the most significant difference is that a lot of the European heritage artists were taking a really human view of the landscape as viewed by human eyes, kind of subject to humans. But in these paintings, you're looking at the land almost bird's eye view. And even that is a really significant difference. And you can see these artworks are rich in symbology. There's an acknowledgement of the animal presence with footprints in the artworks. And there's a sense of important meeting places, of topography, of major landmarks, of watercourses. And that is just a radically different way of considering where humans sit in the landscape. Humans as a small part of the landscape as components, rather than domineering subjects of the landscape, if that makes sense. And oh, sorry, this is another classic artwork. I can get there. Sorry, you can tell I'm built for drawing, not for using technology. So this is another classic. Arthur Streeton, who was of the Heidelberg School, which is basically Australian Impressionism. If anybody says Heidelberg School, you can just know that they're talking about Australian Impressionism. He did a lot of landscapes, beautiful landscapes. But I guess his work makes me want to emphasize something that comes up again and again when looking at artwork, which is the fact that all artwork is mythology to some extent. It's a proposed viewing of a landscape, an altered landscape often, or a very, it's almost always infused with some sense of value of certain cultural priorities. So in this case, with Arthur Streeton, he's chosen to name this very Australian landscape the Land of the Golden Fleece. And this is a reference to the Greek myth of Jason and the Argonauts going in search of the Golden Fleece. So this is a very Eurocentric kind of myth, but he's chosen to name this landscape after that mythology, I think, because he's trying to infuse it with his own kind of sense of what the destiny of the land is and what, you know, the history of the humans that have come to occupy the landscape. And you can see in the foreground, he's got sheep grazing. You can actually see the water windmill there. It's the proper name for that. It pumps water, doesn't it? Yeah, anyway. So there's a sign of human habitation, and you can see that the trees have been cleared and that there's some dieback. So while you've got the wildness in the background, there's actually a sense of kind of diminishing wildness in the foreground and a sense of human presence. So it tells you a little bit about this idea that maybe there was a manifest destiny for, you know, colonial Australians to own the land and to occupy it. This is Albert Namatjira's work. I think most people would know Namatjira, right?
Of course.
Yeah, incredible. So Albert Namatjira was born in Hermansburg Mission, which is not too far from Alice Springs. And he spent a lot of time painting that region, which is his home country. So around like the McDonnell Ranges, and if anyone's been to the Larapinta Trail, that's all of that country. And he was introduced to watercolors by a European artist. And he rose to pretty global fame, not only for his skill as a watercolorist, which you can see here, but also in a kind of backwards way, because he was one of the first Indigenous artists who showed immense skill and adaptability in painting in the European style. So it's kind of a twisted way of admiring someone's work. But what I really wanted to talk about was the kind of subtle rebellion in Namatjira's work, which is that he sees colors in this landscape that I didn't see when I went to the Larapinta. Because when I was walking, I was looking at red earth, scorched earth in some ways, really dry, you know, limited in color. And I was looking at it as someone who couldn't survive in that landscape and would have no idea how to find resources or look after myself. So that really colors my view of the landscape, that it's something kind of dangerous. But when you look at Namatjira's colors, like look at the color in that, like you see such beauty in the landscape. And he also doesn't have any human presence in his work. There's no fence line there. There's no grazing animals. So really, while he's painting in the European style, he's actually depicting the country as he wants to see it. The country perhaps as his culture would have seen it in the dreaming. So on paper, he's obeying the rules, but actually it's his own really subjective view of the land that he's portraying. I think that's beautiful. This is another really interesting Australian artist, Sydney Long. So he painted a lot of pictures incorporating a lot of kind of European mythology. So he'd have images of Australian landscapes with like satyrs dancing around in fields. And he had a lot of kind of European sensibilities that he'd bring into the landscape. But he often incorporated figures as equal components of the landscape with animals. And so there was a sense of portraying people as kind of symbiotes or people that are at peace in the landscape rather than sort of domineering aspects of the landscape. So this is 1904, this painting was completed. I think the White Australia policy was enacted in 1901. So this image of an Indigenous woman teaching the songbirds how to sing probably would have been quite controversial. It's a very early time for him to actually, you know, to incorporate quite a liberal view and a recognition that there's actually a deep mythology and deep connection with the country amongst Indigenous Australians. So I'll just show you one more of his paintings, which I think is really beautiful, which is Spirit of the Plains, and you've got the Brolgas and you've got the figure in the landscape. So there's this kind of sense of harmony. It's not really a sense of, you know, going out and scything the grass, you know, for your own purposes. It's very much, you know, sort of reveling in the beauty of the landscape. So it's kind of a revolutionary view for the time period. And picking up what I'm putting down, the kind of different views of the landscape. Okay, cool. Thanks, and I just wanted to show Russell Drysdale's work as well, because there's something really creepy and haunting about his images. But I think it's really telling that when I look at his work, it's really ominous. It feels like a sense of, you know, portentous doom when I look at his images. And I think it's because we've all been to a dead-end Australian rural town like this, where you think there's nothing to do but play cricket up against the brick wall of the pub, and there's only a couple of, you know, scraggly gum trees left, and there's no vegetation, and there's no sense of relief. And I guess when I look at this, and this is really my modern lens looking at this artwork, I think, well, this is where we're headed in some places in Australia, unless we better manage our resources and look after the land. That sounds very dramatic, but that's what I think of. That's what his work kind of summons in me. That's so. It goes to show, you know, as you were describing, it kind of is a moment in time, but it's always relatable. You know, you'll always find a way to interpret it to, you know, your ways of thinking about the landscape.
This sort of thing from the past, and then we've got, you know, forestry and things like that going on. We've got depletion of resources, which are leaving the same landscape, this dusty, barren, lifeless.
That's what it makes me think of completely. Yeah, it makes me think of like when you drive past an old tip and it's just, just seagulls and hellish landscape.
Silver gulls.
Yes, exactly. Sorry. Yeah. How embarrassing, me of all people, to say seagull. So this is probably a more direct link between conservation and painted by an artist who went down and was part of the Franklin River Dam protests. And I think most people know about the Franklin Dam that was protested against. So it's kind of an interesting artwork, because rather than going in and showing the pristine beauty of the Franklin River and of the forests in that area, the artist has really chosen to just kind of pollute the whole scene with human presence. And I think it's a really interesting view of the landscape, that even amongst people trying to camp out and protect the landscape, it's still kind of like this marring presence in amongst the forest. But I think it's really going to show this kind of complexity and chaos of this modern fight going on, that we're all kind of scrabbling to kind of get what we want in the landscape. And even the sky is kind of polluted with politicians and drama. So yeah, it's a really interesting moment in history that's been captured, and it tells you a lot about the general feeling amongst the community as well.
That one looks like old Soviet artworks, or just politicians striding across the landscape.
Yeah, it's odd to have Bob Brown immense over the landscape. And I think it's because he was looming large as this kind of hero, but also he looked so confused. What is going on here? Like, how can this be happening? And I think in some ways that was probably the general feeling amongst people that were against the damming, is that like, how did, you know, how are we not thinking, you know, bigger picture than this? But yeah. Anyway, my last two examples before I kind of reel it back into a little bit of my work. So I wanted to show Chen Jiawei's work there, which is on the left, sorry, which he painted for the Archibald Prize in 2000. And he chose to do a self-portrait, but he depicted himself in traditional Chinese garb that probably would have been worn in the early 1900s. And he said that he portrayed himself that way because he felt still this ongoing sense of alienation from the mainstream Australian identity. But I really wanted to bring this in because he chose to put a self-oppressive cockatoo on his head. And the reason he did that, he said, was because he felt a strong affinity with the landscape and a strong affinity with Indigenous Australians who also have been alienated from white Australian culture. And so I'm fascinated in Sydney Long's work and other artists' work, how birds and animals often come up as symbols, this kind of point of connection with the landscape. So it just really tells me that the presence of animals is actually really important for us, you know, for our well-being, our sense of identity, and our sense of connection with the landscape. And then finally, I just wanted to bring up this mural. Do you know how to say his last name, Alex? I think it's the same guy who did the Latrobe blue block debate. Anyway, sorry, Jimmy, if you ever hear this. mispronounce your name, but he's known for doing beautiful murals, often of endangered animals. What's really interesting is that often he's doing them on human-made structures. So this is a landscape that does not have a platypus in it anymore. So while it's beautiful to see the platypus, it's also kind of an indictment of the modern condition. I see it, you know, like, well, yeah, I see it that way, that it's sort of, it's reminding us of what's absent, you know, as much as, you know, decorating this space. So I think there's a sense of responsibility that comes with that. So yeah, that's kind of, yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well, it works. It really works. Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to express with all that talk about art and that sense of empathy and emotional connection is that it's the kind of other side of the coin to science. So when it comes to conservation, it's really important that we actually have accurate reads on what's going on in an area, that we can say if we continue to have an influx of deer into the Dandenong Ranges, it's pretty clear that these are going to be the negative consequences for biodiversity. So we need those steps to be able to actually manage land in a really effective way. We need to be rational about those things. We need to be able to measure them. But what I would say, there is something so motivating about human emotion, and that's really the thing that drives action. So the example I think of is my partner Orion, who went up several years back to the Adani coal mine site and protested. And if you think about that in a kind of rational way, you think another body on the line, another body at the protest front, is that actually going to be the difference between the coal mine being open or not? If I'm thinking about it rationally, probably not. But at some level, you couldn't really live with the idea of not going up and doing something about it. It was an emotional drive, I would say. Would you say? Yeah. You're like profoundly angry and passionate about protecting the landscape, so, and the future of the planet. So while you can have all of that rationality, and we like to think of ourselves as logical creatures, we're actually emotional creatures, and that's really what drives a lot of our decision making. So for me, art is really the vessel that kind of drives a lot of thinking and reconnection with landscape, and it drives a lot of action to support biodiversity and remember what's important. So in my own books, before I started writing 100 Australian Birds, which was my first book, which ended up being an Australian field guide to birds, I'd studied anthropology, so I had a lot of interest in human cultures, and then I'd gone on to do environmental science at La Trobe, and then I kind of stopped halfway through because I started writing and finished it. But as I was kind of learning more at uni, and I was spending more time bird watching and bushwalking, and I was making more art, I was sort of thinking about how limited my vocabulary is when it comes to the Australian landscape. And I'm sure that's some personal failings as well, but I also think it's a failing of our education system. I wasn't taught different species of birds or plants, or how to ID things when I was in school. It's something I had to go and seek out for myself. And if you weren't motivated, you're not going to go and spend the time to do that. So when Heidi Grant put out this concept that they wanted a beginner's field guide written, it seemed like this perfect opportunity to merge my various hobbies, but also a way to hopefully hook people who maybe didn't think about how much they loved birds or how significant a role birds play in Australian culture. So yeah, it's sort of, it was an interesting project to come up with at the time, because I was talking to the publisher. I was in the midst of my science degree, and so I had this kind of very scientific approach to it, where I was thinking we have to be really formal and we have to be really accurate with what we're telling people in the bird book, and you have to have all the measurements perfect, you know. And the publisher very much said you should probably just actually back away from that and lean into your individual experience as a bird watcher. So in the book, you'll see that I'm really biased with my entries in the book. I'm actively saying that I don't like noisy miners, but I can still appreciate them for, you know, all their ferocity. And so it's sort of relinquishing that idea that I had to be completely accurate, and instead recognizing the aspect of bird watching that keeps me coming back to noticing things in nature, which is the emotional resonance that bird watching has, you know, the impact it has on my well-being as well. So I think about white-faced herons, which are a bird I'm pretty familiar with. They're not very exotic or anything, but every time I'm driving back to East Gippsland, where my parents live, when I'm crossing the dairy flats, the last sort of minute or two of the drive, I almost always see a pair of white-faced herons there. And to see those birds, it's nothing new, but to know that they're there and that I'm going home to my family and they're still there in that landscape, there is something unquantifiable about that. There's nothing scientific about that. I'm not going, saw them again, you know, it's something more complex than that. So in both my bird book and my book of insects, I'm really trying to hook, you know, that feeling, that admiration for insects and for birds, and try and show people just how beautiful they are, with a hope that they will then recognize them as valuable and want to protect them. So really at the most basic level, if the only thing that someone out of my book is that they pick it up, they open a page and they go, that's a pretty bird, now I know the name of it, that's actually immense to me, because I think I'm mostly preaching to the converted when I do these talks. People who come to these talks mostly know a lot of different species and are passionate about conservation. But it's actually the everyday person who lives in suburbia or in the inner city who doesn't have time to go out bird watching, who's forgotten that connection to the landscape, that I really want to pick up my book, and that they'll go, oh, I remember seeing those birds when I was younger, and I go, oh, this was, you know, this is something essential to my sense of self, you know, this connection to the landscape. So I'm trying to hook the everyday kind of person back into that feeling of connection with the landscape. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I would just reiterate, you know, my general concept was that while science is really important, art is really about emotion, and emotion drives important action. So yeah. Did I go way too fast? No? We've got some time for questions, I guess. So, or I can go back to any previous painting if you want to look at it a little bit longer, or also I've got some of my artworks around here. Maybe I'll get a moving gallery a little bit later on.
That image on you there, is that on YouTube?
Yes, that is.
Can you just
Good
go
eye,
back to
sir.
start my video? Please, thank you.
Sure.
Now the Zoomers can see your face. You actually take a photo of the grass there at that point.
Yeah, Oriental cat picture of me.
I'm like, you're gonna need a photo of you at some point. I'm like, photo. That's the one thing.
It's pretty on brand. Yeah. I didn't really talk about my process that much, but I don't know if anybody has
All your
questions about
illustrations
that.
done from your own subject matter, or do you take philosophy as well?
a bit of both.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I'm drawing birds that I just haven't been able to, you know, capture photos of, or insects. But where I can, I love to use my own photos. I use some of Orion's photos because he takes a lot. We've got a friend, Jason Caruso, who takes beautiful bird photos. So he often lends me photos. But I often find going to videos of birds is actually a really great way to get a sense of their movement. Like, I think some of my style is to try and incorporate a sense of motion or a sense of character in the birds. And, you know, that's my way of trying to portray what I see in the birds. So to actually see them kind of doing their thing in a video is really helpful as well.
Because it's seeing it, you know, on a branch, on a log or something like that, its anatomy changes, so
Yeah.
getting a feel for
Yeah.
displacement of feathers.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, my artworks are still, even though I try to be accurate, you know, it's got a certain level of license, as all art does. And, you know, that's just my flavor coming through, I guess.
Picking on it, show.
Yeah. Trust me, any expert on any area is going to, yeah, is going to tell you when you've got it. That's just happened multiple times with me.
Yeah, I'll just put out to the Zoomers to go to their questions first if you can.
Yeah, sure.
And Ian has asked, how long does it take to draw or paint a bird?
Oh, well.
And if you could maybe just repeat the question, because I'm not sure if my voice.
Yeah, sure. So the question from the Zoom was,
Oh, actually, no, the Zoomers can see it.
they can see it? Okay, cool. Anyway, so how long does it take? It depends a little bit. When I was doing illustrations for my books, I was working against a pretty strict deadline. And so I had to draw quickly. So I was using a lot of ink, refillable ink markers to do a lot of my work. So usually I would write for the morning and then I would draw in the afternoons. And if I was really efficient, I would get a decent outline and some shading done in one of those afternoon sessions and then finish the coloring the next day. But if I had a day where I was just drawing, I could get through one and maybe a bit in a day. But if I'm doing, like, a lot of my paintings here, I think the kookaburra is down here maybe. Yeah, which is watercolor, which is a lot slower for me. So that took a couple of days of painting, but it depends what else you've got on. When you get in a flow, it goes faster, but yeah.
Feel pretty good for the output.
Yeah.
End result, I think.
No. Thank you.
Emma's got a question. Do you ever make art in nature?
This is actually on my mind because recently I went for a walk and someone was down by Belgrave like Park and they had their easel out and they were actually drawing the ducks down there. And I thought that would be a really nice thing to do. But I think I'm still not, if I want a final product that say it's going to go into a published work, usually I won't be able to finish it enough in the field. So I actually haven't done that, but I'd like to. Yeah, I think it'd be great to go and take an easel out and just do some sketches in the wilds. But yeah, maybe future project.
Question from Karen. So this is Karen that actually worked on the Franklin campaign in a
cool.
big way. With,
Thanks, Karen.
So Karen said, if you could do one thing that would help non-First Nations Australians connect with nature, what would it be? And what do you think organisations like FOSC could do?
Oh, Karen, that's a big question. I mean, I feel like there's such a sense of urgency about how quickly things are changing and degrading. And part of me always wants to like grab people on the by the collar, you know, when I'm on the train, I'm like, do you realize the climate is changing? And like just throw people into a panic. But I think that actually shuts people down. People don't want to think about how huge things are and how fast things are moving. So I almost think, I guess my books are kind of an expression of what I think the most important thing you can do is, which is to start noticing, which sounds really basic, but like take out your headphones when you go through the park to work and go, oh, it's a really cool duck. Or look at that duck nesting in that tree, or noticing the same magpie family in your backyard, which sounds super trivial, but I think that's kind of the gateway to starting to notice more and go, oh, everything is connected and all of it is connected to resources and we've got to treat the land better. So that, that's probably the biggest thing I would say. But in terms of FOSC, don't know, keep re-vegging and keep weeding, keep holding community events. I guess that's probably the biggest thing, is getting other people on board. And yeah,
It seems to come on in the word awareness.
Yeah,
Everything that you spoke about is awareness of everything.
yeah. And I think we have a great capacity for noticing, but it's like we kind of unlearn that when we are forced to work really long hours. And I think people are generally really stressed out and run off their feet. And so to kind of take the time to go, oh, actually, I'm going to tune back in again. Like, it takes a bit of effort, but I think most people are actually, they have that sense of biophilia. They have a love for natural phenomena. It's just like something needs to bring it back in again. Like, I don't think there's that many people that you would go, oh, isn't this a beautiful fern? And people would be like, it's just boring, when you actually engage and you go, oh, this is an amazing thing. I don't know, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just super nerdy. I think ferns are cool. Anyway. Yeah.
Toby's got a question. In the Dandenongs, where's the favourite space to go bird watching?
Oh, giving away the secrets. Personally, I love going, it's not really in the Dandenongs anymore. I love going to Listerfield. There's always good water birds and there's always great crested grebes and different landscapes. But even just walking in Sherbrooke itself, you always see something different and just have a day. Sorry, there. Okay, I haven't been.
Stuff in there and on fire like it's on fire.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, thank you for the tip. I'll have to check it out. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Any other questions from the audience in the room?
I love it, but modern generation of children coming through don't. So how are we going to get that book? Get kids into life?
Can you paraphrase?
Yeah, sure. So the question is kind of about how, given the modern generations are picking up books less and less, how do you engage kids with kind of environmental awareness, all of the environment? I mean, I don't have kids of my own, so it's a bit tricky. I mean, I'd like to think that if you started having your kids outside a little bit more away from devices, that there would be something that would spark their curiosity, and maybe it's just bugs, or maybe it's mushrooms, or maybe it's, looking at water courses, something, or even geology. Like as soon as I started learning geology at uni, I was like, this is incredible. But I literally would never have thought about rocks before that. So there just has to be something that grabs their attention. And as soon as they're going, oh, I think that bug is pretty cool, you can be like, I'm just going to foster that nerdy obsession as much as I can, but yeah, at least, with the illustrated books, I hope that, even if people are just looking at illustrations, it's just a start, just, yeah.